Point of order, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table in the House the letter from Mr Little addressed to a constituent in Otaki asking them about housing problems in Masterton.
Leave us sought to table that particular letter. Is there any objection? There is objection. Order. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Nick Smith and I think, were the only two people to have attended the 1992 Rio conference, the original, which produced the original Framework Convention. Mr Smith has just advanced. I'm not sure that our paths have converged too much in the intervening 23 years, but hope springs eternal. And I invite the Honourable Nick Smith to reflect on green policy over the next few years, because the government does need to take on board green policies. Mr Smith advanced the usual claims about New Zealand's initiatives in global climate change. Unerringly, his government focuses on what other countries should be doing, while New Zealand's emissions continue to increase. Mr Speaker, I'll be on the plane in a few hours heading to Paris, and look forward to interacting with the Honourable Simon Bridges and Tim Grosser and others in a constructive way. But it will be constructive criticism that we will be bringing to bear on this government's policy. Let us remember, sir, that the Paris Agreement will not, in fact, be the first global agreement, which is how it is being described. That was in 1992. The Rio Convention called for emissions to stabilise to prevent dangerous climate change. It has taken 23 years for all governments to agree to submit national targets. We should all be ashamed that it has taken this long. In 1990, annual global emissions were 38 billion tonnes. Today they are 53 billion. Had we stabilised by, say, 2000, or even if the developed world had stabilised as the Rio Convention had called for, we would be safe below the 2 degrees. The Paris Agreement will succeed in being the first protocol of Rio to require a commitment from all parties to cut or limit emissions. But that should have occurred in Copenhagen 6 years ago. Back then, global emissions were 49 billion tonnes, 4 billion less than today. We keep losing precious time, taunting the gods. The main problem that will come out of Paris, sir, is the ponderous formality of the peer review mechanism, the so-called global stocktake. This, sir, will commence only after the Paris Agreement has entered into force, in fact, not until 2022. That is too late. It must start in 2016. And peer reviews will not do it. I've had experience with international peer reviews, having defended the New Zealand aid program in Paris before the OECD 2 decades ago. That year, our ODA was 0.28% of GNI. What is it today? 0.28%. A peer review of inadequate voluntary targets that starts several years after the scientists say global emissions are meant to peak virtually guarantees failure to stay under the 2-degree threshold. Meanwhile, our Prime Minister has told an unsuspecting world that, quote, while New Zealand's emissions are small on a global scale, we are determined to make a strong contribution. It clearly depends on what we mean by strong, because our current emission projections for 2030 will make a strong contribution to a 3.5-degree world, which is described by the World Bank as catastrophic. Mr. Key reminded the world that, quote, New Zealand faces unique domestic challenges in reducing emissions. So, of course, does every other country. That's why we have the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Part of the unique New Zealand challenge is that we're one of the highest per capita emitters in the world, and we bear disproportionate responsibility for historical emissions. The Prime Minister does not include this in his structured worldview of climate policy. Our emissions trading scheme, he then said, remains our key policy tool in reducing emissions. Those present were too courteous to laugh, but the fact that emissions have soared, not reduced, under the ETS since he took office 7 years ago. The Prime Minister rounded off his contribution by concluding that New Zealand is determined to play its part and make a real difference. That too, sir, is an epic statement. I wonder whether anyone has whispered to the Prime Minister what percentage reduction might be required of New Zealand to play its part in sharing the global carbon budget for a 2-degree world. Sir, that is closer to 70%. 70%, not 11%. May Paris be a success, but let us not delude ourselves over the magnitude of this challenge.
The Honourable